I was mocked for being old-fashioned, but my traditions saved the family they almost lost. They laughed at me, my own family. Not cruel laughter at first, no. It started softer than that. I rolls across the dinner table, whispers behind polite smiles. "Oh, that's just Mom being Mom," my son would say, his voice carrying that apologetic tone children use when they're embarrassed by their parents. And Claire, my daughter-in-law, she'd smile that tight, sharp smile of hers, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and suggest gently that perhaps my ways were a bit much for the modern world. I didn't argue. I simply kept lighting my candles, setting my table, and holding on to the threads of tradition like a woman clutching a lifeboat in a storm she could already see gathering on the horizon. Welcome, my dear. This is Grandma Alice Stories, where every tale carries a lesson and every wound carries wisdom. Pour yourself some tea, settle into your favorite chair, and listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's a reminder that the old ways, the ones we're so quick to discard, sometimes hold the very medicine we'll desperately need when everything else fails. So sit close now, and let me take you back to where it all began. It started on a crisp October Sunday, the kind of afternoon where the light comes golden through the windows and makes everything look like it's been dipped in honey. I'd spent the morning preparing dinner the way I always did, roasting a chicken with rosemary from my garden, mashing potatoes by hand, setting the table with my grandmother's china that I only brought out for family gatherings. The lace tablecloth I'd embroidered 30 years ago lay smooth and white, and in the center, I'd placed fresh chrysanthemums in a crystal vase. My son David and his family were coming for Sunday dinner. It was our tradition. Had been for years, though lately, I'd noticed they arrived later, stayed shorter, and their attention seemed to drift toward the glowing screens in their pockets more than toward each other. But I held on to hope the way I held on to those traditions. Because what else does a mother do? They arrived at 3 o'clock, though dinner was meant for 1. Claire stepped through my door like she was entering a museum. Careful, observant, slightly uncomfortable. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Tall and polished, with hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place and clothes that whispered expensive without ever shouting it. My grandchildren, sweet Emma, who was 12, and Daniel, who just turned 15, trudged in behind her, eyes already glazed from whatever they'd been watching in the car. "Mom, you didn't have to go to all this trouble," David said, kissing my cheek. But his eyes told a different story. They said, "Please don't make this difficult. Please don't embarrass me." "It's no trouble," I replied, smoothing my apron. "It's what we do. It's who we are." Claire's smile tightened. We sat down to eat, and I said grace the way my mother taught me, the way her mother taught her. I folded my hands, bowed my head, and gave thanks for the food, for the family, for the roof over our heads. When I opened my eyes, Emma and Daniel were staring at their empty plates, shifting uncomfortably. Claire's expression was carefully neutral, but I could read the judgment in the set of her shoulders. "So," Claire said brightly, cutting into her chicken, "we've been talking about the holidays. We're thinking of doing something different this year. Maybe a resort? Somewhere tropical? The kids could really use a break from all the routine. The way she said it made it sound like a prison sentence. "What about Christmas here?" I asked quietly. "We always—" "Mom," David interrupted gently. "The kids are getting older. They need new experiences. You understand." I looked at my grandchildren. Emma was texting under the table. Daniel had his earbuds halfway in, one foot tapping to a rhythm only he could hear. They hadn't tasted my cooking. They hadn't noticed the flowers or the china or the care I'd woven into every detail of this meal. "I see," I said softly, but I didn't. Not really. The dinner continued in that awkward, painful way that gatherings do when everyone is present but no one is really there. Claire talked about her new promotion, her fitness routine, the private school they were considering for Emma. David nodded along, proud and supportive, but I noticed how he never quite met my eyes. And the children, oh, my sweet grandchildren. They were ghosts at the table, their bodies present but their souls somewhere in the digital ether. As Claire helped me clear the dishes, a gesture I suspected was more about appearances than genuine help, she paused at the kitchen sink, looking around my small, simple home. "Alice," she said, her voice taking on that careful, therapeutic tone. "Have you ever thought about updating? Modernizing a bit? David worries about you here all alone with all these old things." She gestured vaguely at my grandmother's quilt hanging on the wall, my collection of handwritten recipe cards in their wooden box, the photographs in mismatched frames covering every surface. "These aren't old things," I said quietly, running my fingers along the edge of the quilt. "They're memories, they're roots." Claire smiled that smile again. "Of course, but roots can also hold us back, can't they? Sometimes we need to let go of the past to make room for the future." Something cold settled in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper, a kind of grief for what was being lost piece by piece, Sunday by Sunday. "They left before dessert." "Too full," Claire said. "The kids had homework. David had emails to catch up on." I stood in my doorway and watched them drive away in their sleek car, and I wondered when exactly my family had become strangers who tolerated my presence rather than cherished it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, the same bed I'd shared with my husband for 40 years before he passed, and I thought about Claire's words. Roots can hold us back. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was old-fashioned. Maybe my traditions were chains rather than comfort. But then I thought about my grandmother's hands teaching mine to knead bread. I thought about my mother's voice singing hymns while she ironed. I thought about every Sunday dinner, every handwritten letter, every prayer whispered in the dark. All the invisible threads that had held our family together through wars and depressions and losses that should have broken us. And I knew, with the certainty that only comes with age and experience, that what Claire saw as chains were actually lifelines. I just didn't know yet how desperately they would need them. Over the next few months, the distance grew. Calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. And when they did come, there was a tension in the air, something brittle and breaking that no one wanted to name. I watched my son's shoulders grow heavier with burdens he wouldn't share. I watched Claire's perfect smile develop cracks. I watched my grandchildren retreat further into their screens, their eyes emptying a little more each time. And I waited, because grandmothers, my dear, we know something that the young have yet to learn. Life has a way of teaching the lessons we're too proud to hear. And sometimes, the very traditions we mock become the anchors that save us from drowning. I just didn't know that the storm was already closer than any of us realized. And that when it hit, it would shatter everything they thought they knew about strength, family, and what truly matters. That's when the phone call came. The phone rang at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, the kind of call that makes your heart stop before you even answer. I knew, the way mothers always know, that something had broken. What I didn't know was how completely their world had already shattered, or that the pieces they'd been so carefully arranging had all been built on sand. "Welcome back, my dear. You've returned to Grandma Alice Stories, and I'm grateful you're here. What I'm about to share isn't easy. It's the part where pride meets reality, where modern certainty collides with ancient truth. Keep your tea close and remember, sometimes the breaking is what makes room for the healing." Now, let me tell you about the night everything changed. "Mom!" David's voice cracked through the phone like breaking glass. "Mom, I need help." I was already sitting up, reaching for my robe. In 40 years of motherhood, I'd never heard my son cry. Not when he broke his arm at 8. Not when his father died. But now, in the darkness of early morning, I heard something worse than tears. I heard defeat. "What's happened?" I kept my voice steady, calm. This was no time for panic. "I lost my job 3 months ago." The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them behind a dam that had finally burst. "I didn't tell you because Claire said we'd figure it out." She said her income would cover us. But Mom, the savings are gone. The bills are piling up. And the kids. His voice broke completely. The kids are falling apart, and I don't know how to hold this family together anymore. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness, I could see it all so clearly. The perfect facade crumbling, the modern life built on credit and appearance collapsing under the weight of reality. But I didn't say any of that. A mother's job isn't to say, "I told you so." It's to catch her children when they fall, no matter how far or how hard. "Bring them here," I said simply. "Pack what you need and bring them to me." "Mom, we can't." "Yes, you can. And you will. I'll have breakfast ready." The silence on the other end told me everything. Pride was wrestling with desperation, and desperation was winning. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." They arrived as dawn was breaking, pulling up in that sleek car that now seemed like a monument to everything they'd lost. I watched from my kitchen window as they unloaded. Not the careful, composed family that had graced my doorstep months ago, but something raw and broken. Claire's hair hung limp around her face. David's shoulders curved inward like a man trying to make himself smaller. And my grandchildren. Oh, my babies. They moved like sleepwalkers, hollow-eyed and lost. I opened the door before they could knock. "Come in," I said, and stepped aside to let them enter my small, old-fashioned home. The one Claire had suggested I modernize. The one filled with memories and traditions and all those roots she thought held people back. They collapsed into my living room like refugees from a war zone. And in a way, I suppose they were. I brought them tea first. Not coffee, tea. The chamomile and lavender blend my mother used to make for troubled times. I'd learned long ago that sometimes healing begins with the smallest rituals, the gentlest gestures. Claire took the cup with trembling hands and started talking, words spilling out like water from a broken pipe. The job loss had come suddenly, corporate downsizing, they'd called it. They'd kept it secret, certain David would find something quickly. He was talented, educated, connected. But months passed and the interviews led nowhere. They'd burned through their savings maintaining appearances, keeping the kids in private school, keeping up with the mortgage on the house they couldn't afford. I thought if we just kept going, kept pushing forward, everything would work out, Claire said, and for the first time since I'd known her, that polished exterior had completely fallen away. What remained was just a frightened woman who'd bet everything on a future that hadn't materialized. I thought strength meant not asking for help, not admitting weakness. I reached across and took her hand. "Strength, my dear, is knowing when the weight is too heavy to carry alone." Emma sat curled in the corner of my couch, knees pulled to her chest, phone clutched in her hand, but for once, not looking at it. Daniel stood by the window, staring out at nothing. His jaw clenched tight the way his father's used to get when he was trying not to cry. "How long has it been since you all sat down for a meal together?" I asked quietly. David and Claire exchanged glances. I don't remember," David admitted. "And when did you last really talk to your children? Not about schedules or grades, but really talk." The silence was answer enough. I didn't lecture. I didn't remind them of all the Sundays they'd cut short or the traditions they'd dismissed. Instead, I did what my grandmother had done for me when my world fell apart all those years ago. I gave them structure when everything felt chaotic, ritual when everything felt meaningless, and presence when everything felt hollow. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, standing up with the kind of authority that only grandmothers possess. "First, we're going to have breakfast together. A real breakfast at the table with no phones. Then we're going to make a plan, not for tomorrow or next month, but for today. Just today. One day at a time." "Mom, you don't understand," David started. "I understand more than you think," I interrupted gently. "I understand that you've been running so fast toward the future that you forgot to build a foundation in the present. I understand that you've been so busy acquiring things that you forgot to nurture connection. And I understand that right now, You need less of what the modern world told you was important, and more of what you've been calling old-fashioned. Claire made a sound, half laugh, half sob. You were right. About everything. And I was so cruel to you. So dismissive. Stop, I said firmly. We don't have time for guilt. We have work to do. Over the next few hours, I watched something shift. We cooked breakfast together, scrambled eggs, toast made from bread I'd baked the day before, fruit salad with oranges from my neighbor's tree. Simple food made with hands instead of microwaves. Emma asked if she could help, and I taught her how to whisk eggs properly, how to know when the toast is perfectly golden. Small things, ancient things. Daniel put his phone down, actually put it down, and asked if he could set the table. I showed him where my grandmother's china lived, and as he handled each plate carefully, I told him the story behind them. How they'd survived the Depression. How they'd been set for celebrations and sorrows, births and deaths. Every important moment in our family's history. They're just plates, he said, but his voice was uncertain, like he was asking a question rather than making a statement. No, sweetheart, I replied, guiding his hands as he placed them on the table. Their memory, their continuity, their proof that we've survived hard things before, and will survive them again. We sat down to eat at 10 in the morning. The 5 of us crowded around my small table, the one Claire had once looked at with barely concealed pity. And before we began, I did something I hadn't dared to do in months. Let's say grace, I said quietly. No one objected. David reached for his wife's hand. Claire reached for Emma's. Emma reached for Daniel's. Daniel reached for mine. And we formed a circle, connected by touch and need and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way through this darkness. I prayed. Not a fancy prayer or a long one. Just words from the heart, asking for strength and guidance and the wisdom to see what truly mattered. When I opened my eyes, I saw tears streaming down Claire's face. Not the controlled, camera-ready tears of someone performing emotion, but the raw, honest tears of someone finally admitting they were lost. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to live simply. I don't know how to fix this. I squeezed her hand. Then it's a good thing you're not alone. And it's a good thing that what's broken can still be mended, if we're willing to use the right tools. We finished breakfast in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but the peaceful silence of people too exhausted to pretend anymore. And as I cleared the plates, I noticed Emma watching me, really watching me, for the first time in years. Grandma, she said softly, will you teach me the things you know, the old ways? My heart swelled, but I kept my voice steady. Yes, sweetheart, I'll teach you everything. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell any of them yet, was that the real lessons hadn't even begun. Because learning to bake bread and set a proper table was just the surface. The deeper work, the harder work, was learning to face what they'd been running from. Themselves, each other, and the emptiness they'd been trying to fill with everything except what actually mattered. And that work would test us all in ways I couldn't yet imagine. They say the darkest hour comes just before dawn, but I've learned that dawn doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, painfully, one difficult moment at a time. And for my family, huddled in my small home with their pride shattered and their future uncertain, that dawn would require something harder than they'd ever imagined. The courage to unlearn everything they thought they knew about living. Welcome back to Grandma Alice Stories, dear ones. If you've walked with me this far, you know we're in the tender part now, the part where wounds begin to heal but not without pain. Pour yourself something warm, settle in close, and let me show you what happened when a family that had lost its way finally stopped running and started remembering. This is where the real transformation begins. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the lack of money or the uncertainty about the future, though those shadows hung heavy over us all. No, the hardest part was watching my family go through withdrawal. That's what I called it, though I never said it out loud. Withdrawal from the constant noise, the endless distractions, the frantic pace that had been drowning them slowly for years. On the second morning, Daniel came downstairs at 6:30, restless and irritable, his fingers twitching toward pockets that no longer held his phone. I'd made a rule the night before. Phone stayed in a basket by the door, checked only twice a day. Claire had actually gasped when I suggested it, like I'd asked them to stop breathing. "I can't sleep," Daniel said, hovering in the kitchen doorway, uncomfortable in the stillness. "Then come help me," I replied, pulling out my mixing bowl. "We're making bread." He looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "Bread? Like, from scratch? Is there any other way?" I showed him how to measure the flour, how to proof the yeast, how to knead the dough with the heels of his hands. At first, he was clumsy, frustrated by the stickiness, annoyed by the time it took. But slowly, so slowly I could see the exact moment it happened. Something shifted in his face. His shoulders dropped. His breathing deepened. The angry tension in his jaw softened. "It's weird," he said after 20 minutes of kneading in silence. "I feel calmer." "That's because your hands are busy," I told him, covering the dough to let it rise. "When our hands are busy creating something real, our minds stop racing quite so fast. Your generation calls it mindfulness. My generation just called it living." He smiled. A small, genuine smile that reminded me of the little boy he used to be before screens and schedules and the pressure to be perpetually productive had stolen his childhood. Emma was harder to reach. She drifted through those first days like a ghost, curled up in corners with her arms wrapped around herself, mourning the life she'd lost. The friends who'd stopped texting when they found out her family was struggling. The private school she'd had to leave. The illusion of perfection that had defined her entire identity. On the fourth day, I found her crying in my garden, sitting among the tomatoes and herbs, her face red and swollen. "Everyone knows," she sobbed. "Everyone knows we're poor now. Everyone knows we're failures." I sat down beside her, my old knees protesting, and pulled her into my arms. "Baby girl, listen to me. Poverty isn't about how much money you have. It's about how empty your soul is. And honey, you've been spiritually poor for a long time. You just didn't know it because you were too distracted to notice." She pulled back, looking at me with those red-rimmed eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for years I watched you collect followers instead of friends. I watched you perform happiness for cameras instead of feeling it in your heart. I watched you have everything and enjoy nothing." I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "This thing that happened to your family? It might be the greatest gift you ever receive, if you let it teach you what you need to learn." "How can losing everything be a gift?" she whispered. "Because sometimes we have to lose what doesn't matter to find what does." I handed her a trowel. "Come on, let me teach you how to plant something." We spent the afternoon in the dirt, my hands guiding hers, showing her how to make space in the earth for seeds, how to water them gently, how to trust that what looks like nothing buried in darkness will eventually push toward the light. "Will they really grow?" she asked, dusting soil from her hands. "If you tend them," I replied. "If you're patient. If you show up every day, even when you can't see progress happening. Just like healing, sweetheart. Just like family. Just like love." David and Claire, they struggled in different ways. My son carried his shame like a physical weight, his shoulders perpetually hunched, his eyes avoiding mine whenever the conversation turned to the future. He'd sent out dozens of resumes and heard nothing back. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier he became. One evening, after dinner, I found him standing in my study, looking at the photographs on the wall. Pictures of his father, of his grandparents, of generations of our family stretching back to people whose names he barely remembered. "I've failed them," he said quietly. "I've failed everyone." "You haven't failed," I replied, coming to stand beside him. "You've stumbled. There's a difference. Dad never would have let this happen. He always knew what to do." I almost laughed, but I caught myself. "Your father was lost more times than you know. He just didn't advertise it the way your generation does. When we lost the farm in '82, when I miscarried our second child, when his business partner embezzled everything, your father felt like a failure then too. But you know what he did? David shook his head. He came home, to family, to the people who loved him not for what he accomplished, but for who he was. And he let us hold him up until he could stand again. I turned to face my son fully. That's not weakness, David. That's wisdom. Knowing when to lean and who to lean on. Tears spilled down his cheeks. I'm so sorry, Mom. Sorry I didn't listen. Sorry I let Claire convince me that your ways were outdated. Sorry I stayed away. Hush, I said, pulling him into my arms the way I used to when he was small. We don't apologize for being human. We just do better when we know better. Claire transformed the most dramatically, though it happened so gradually I almost didn't notice at first. The woman who'd walked through my door that first morning. Polished, perfect, armored in designer clothes and practiced smiles, began to crack open like a seed splitting to let new growth emerge. She started joining me in the kitchen, asking questions about recipes, about techniques, about the stories behind each dish. My mother never taught me to cook, she admitted one afternoon as we rolled out pie dough together. She said it was old-fashioned, that modern women didn't need to know how. She hired people for that. And what did she teach you instead? I asked gently. Claire's hands stilled. How to look right. How to say the right things. How to marry well and maintain appearances. Her voice cracked. She taught me everything except how to actually live. I covered her flour-dusted hands with mine. Then it's a good thing life is giving you a second chance to learn. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine humility. Will you teach me, Alice? Not just cooking, but everything? How to make a home instead of just a showplace. How to raise children instead of just managing them. How to be a wife instead of just a partner in a business arrangement. Oh, sweetheart, I said, pulling her into a hug that left us both covered in flour. That's exactly what I've been waiting to do. By the end of that first week, something had shifted in my small home. The air felt different, heavier with presence, lighter with pretense. We established rhythms. Breakfast together every morning, no exceptions. Dinner around the table every evening, with everyone contributing. Grace before meals. Conversations after, lingering over coffee and tea, learning to sit with each other without distractions. Emma started keeping a journal, writing by hand in a notebook I'd given her instead of typing into her phone. Daniel discovered he actually enjoyed working with his hands, fixing things around my house that had needed attention for months. David began taking long walks each morning, coming back calmer, clearer, more like himself. And Claire started baking. Every morning, she'd wake before dawn and join me in the kitchen, learning to coax life from flour and water and time. She wasn't good at first. Her bread came out dense, her cookies burned, her pie crusts cracked, but she kept trying. And with each attempt, I watched her learn patience, humility, and the grace of imperfection. I always thought success meant never failing, she said one morning, staring at a collapsed soufflé. But you fail at something every day, and you just keep going. Because failure isn't the opposite of success, I replied, already pulling out ingredients for another attempt. It's part of the path toward it. Every woman who ever made a perfect pie crust made 100 terrible ones first. The secret isn't avoiding failure. It's not letting failure stop you from trying again. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. How did you get so wise? I laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in my belly. Oh, honey, I'm not wise. I've just lived long enough to make every mistake there is and learned something from most of them. 3 weeks after they'd arrived on my doorstep, broken and desperate, we sat together on my front porch in the evening coolness. Emma was sketching in her journal. Daniel was carving a piece of wood, something he'd discovered he had a talent for. David and Claire sat side by side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, comfortable in a silence that no longer needed filling. "Mom," David said quietly, "I got a call today from that company I interviewed with last month. They want me to start next week." My heart should have leapt. Instead, it squeezed with something bittersweet. Joy mixed with the certain knowledge that this chapter was ending, that they would leave my small home and return to their own lives. But when I looked at their faces, I saw something that hadn't been there before. Not just relief, but readiness. Not just hope, but groundedness. They'd come to me as refugees from a life that had collapsed. They were leaving as people who'd remembered how to actually live. "That's wonderful news," I said, and meant it. Claire squeezed my hand. "We're not going far, and we're not going back to how things were." She looked at her family, gathered on this porch in the fading light. "We're taking this with us. All of it. The traditions, the rhythms, the presents. The things we almost lost forever." Emma looked up from her journal. "Can we still come for Sunday dinners, Grandma?" I smiled, my heart full to bursting. "Oh, sweetheart, my door is always open. My table is always set. And there will always be a place for you here, whenever you need reminding of who you really are. Because that's what tradition does, my dear. It doesn't hold us back. It holds us together. And in a world that's constantly pulling us apart, that might be the most revolutionary thing of all." If this story touched your heart, dear one, please subscribe to Grandma Alice Stories for more tales of wisdom, redemption, and the kind of life lessons that only come with age and experience. Every story here carries a truth that someone, somewhere, desperately needs to hear. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories inspire mine. And if you believe someone in your life needs to hear this message, share the story with them. Sometimes, the words we most need to hear come wrapped in someone else's experience. Until next time, keep your tea warm, your heart open, and remember, the old ways aren't chains, they're lifelines. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give the people we love is showing them the way back home. With love, Grandma Alice.